a quick overview then of many of the things that we've been talking about in the session so far, but perhaps to make them kind of explicit. Each of the country studies that we've been looking at so far are faced with a range of different kinds of challenges in terms of transitioning towards low carbon growth. And I've got some of them up there. Certainly in terms of building a regional framework for this, we've got highly uneven and uncertain regulatory environment. The adoption of many of the technologies which are required for this often require high upfront capital costs. And as we've heard already, there's often not very much finance around in order to achieve this. Often we have low levels of capacity and a need for technology transfer. And you can see there some of the mechanisms which are often mooted to try and get some way towards these kinds of processes. So they may be national, they may be local. There's obviously a need to try and think through the financing mechanisms, taxation, and perhaps a long way down the line how carbon markets might be integrated within the region. One of the things that I found really interesting in trying to put together this paper is the predominance of private sector financing or institutional investment. Obviously, given many of the countries in the region don't necessarily have the financial capacity by themselves in order to undertake these transitions, and so private sector finance, both from within and outside the region, is going to be important in this process. So, as a consequence, we can see that there's the regional cooperation is an important mechanism by which these kinds of transitions can take place. Now, those of you who were in Jakarta at the first workshop this year will have heard a much more detailed overview of the New Zealand situation and the kind of things which are taking place there. Essentially, we have it's a slightly unusual case, I think, in as much as, on the one hand, New Zealand has a very great proportion of its energy generated from renewable sources. So it stands around 70% at the moment. A lot of that is from hydro. There's also a proportion which is from wind, geothermal, tidal is coming up, and solar is a smaller but still important contributor. It's feasible, depending on political will, for this to go much higher. There's, I think it's fair to say, a bipartisan support for increasing this to 90%. And some commentators suggest that it's feasible for this to go to 100% if there was sufficient political will. So with a small population and these kinds of advantages, New Zealand's really in an unusual situation, and it's a situation which is only shared by perhaps a few other countries in the world, Iceland, Norway, etc. On the other hand, when we look at such a small population, only 4.4 million people, we see a very high greenhouse gas emission per capita. Partly this is about the fact that it's an agriculturally based economy, and so a lot of the emissions come from that. You will remember perhaps last time I spoke about the tremendous conversion to dairy that's taking place in the country, and that this is having an accelerating effect on this. It's also a place where transport continues to be a very significant contributor. There isn't particularly well-developed mechanisms in terms of both commercial and private transport. Most of this is based on fossil fuels. So depending on how you view this situation, this creates either some opportunities or some challenges. For the current government, their perspective on this is that this gives New Zealand very little leeway in terms of trying to reduce its emissions by the transformation of its energy sources. So this is, as I'll talk about in a second, this is the line which they've been pushing in international negotiations in the last couple of years. And essentially, many other countries can, just like we heard about the EU, there's the potential to try and transform energy sources away from fossil fuels, etc., and create that divergence between GDP growth and emissions. There's an argument that New Zealand finds this much more difficult because of its current position with renewable energy generation. This has all sorts of implications for how it's looking to international offsets. And so this is one of the reasons why, as I'll talk about in a little while, why New Zealand's been particularly active in terms of trying to think through the capacity to link carbon markets regionally and internationally. So there's lots more to say about the New Zealand context, potentially, but I think it's much more important that we think about its role and potential role in terms of regional cooperation. So these are some of the possibilities for that kind of regional cooperation. As with many of the other case studies that we've heard already so far, multilateral, bilateral, institutional investment in carbon markets. In terms of multilateral investment, obviously New Zealand is a contributor to a range of multilateral institutions. The one that I've highlighted there is its contribution to the ADB because of its relevance to the region that we're talking about. Beyond its level of subscription, etc., I couldn't actually find very many instances of the country providing co-financing with the ADB for specific projects in the region towards low carbon growth. Certainly there are some instances in the Pacific, and I've given you one there in the case of Papua New Guinea. Something which is a great uncertainty, I suppose, for all of us, but something to think about is what will happen with the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. New Zealand is a founding member of this. Obviously, China and now India contributing a great share of this, and it will be interesting to see the contribution that this new institution will make in terms of the things that we've been talking about. But at the moment, it's completely uncertain in terms of New Zealand's role beyond its declared contribution. So moving on to bilateral development cooperation. Again, it's there's a lot of potential here, but I think it's fair to say that New Zealand's emphasis in terms of its commitments are not focused on Asia. And there's good reason to this in terms of the current government's emphasis on strengthening its role in the Pacific in particular. And so while there are instances where NZ8 is moving towards enhancing various things in Asia, and I'll talk about some of those in a second. It's also the case that since 2008 there's been a very definite and declared shift towards a greater emphasis on the Pacific and a much greater emphasis on reducing the role of poverty alleviation and orienting the program much more towards foreign policy objectives. And so we certainly continue to see instances where NZ aid is contributing in Asia, but it's also the case that they have withdrawn from many of the activities which perhaps they would have in the past. So I think it's this year, perhaps it's last year. We do have some good examples of the kind of programs which we can see can make a definite contribution. The one that I'm mentioning here is in terms of geothermal development in eastern Indonesia. As you can see, this is a partnership with Gajah Mada University, and it's essentially about both reducing the risks of geothermal expansion, but also cataloguing, building community support, and trying to produce opportunities or make local people aware of the opportunities which might flow from this, as well as capacity building and training. New Zealand, of course, is one of the has a long history of geothermal development, and this is an obvious area that the country can make a contribution to Indonesia and the Philippines. So this is an interesting example of that. Of course, when we're talking about eastern Indonesia or similar environments in the region, it would make sense, you would think, that that there would be a focus for a country like New Zealand on things like building solar capacity. Now, this is largely not happening, but we see that a similar process is happening in other parts of the world. And so I put this in here, not to dwell on it too much, but just to talk about the role that NZ aid is taking place in supporting solar and wind development. This is both on and off the grid. And so there's a couple of instances, for example, over here in the Cook Islands we have instances where they're contributing directly to the main grid in the capital city, but also developing smaller scale mini grids on outer islands. And a similar kind of thing in terms of capacity building, in terms of energy sector plans in another small Pacific island, set of Pacific islands, Tuvalu. We have a similar set of processes happening with geothermal in island states in Africa and the Caribbean. In terms of capacity building, NZ8 has a very upfront or explicit commitment to trying to bring students from around the region to study at New Zealand tertiary institutions, which have an explicit focus on some of the things that we've been looking at. So renewable energy, geothermal, solar, hydro, etc., and also some sectors around adaptation and resilience. So I've given you an example there of one of the most long-running and significant institutions in this case, the University of Auckland's Geothermal Institute, which is responsible for training lots and lots of graduates from the region in these kind of technologies. So some instances there of technology transfer and capacity building. New Zealand, of course, has an emissions trading scheme. It's been set up for a few years now. It covers all 6 gases in the Kyoto Protocol. It's a slightly strange kind of hybrid system, I suppose, in as much as the domestic emissions units are not compliant with the Kyoto units. There's a guaranteed purchase of $25 for the units, but people from outside can use international Kyoto units to buy into that market. So because of that, the New Zealand ETS is comparatively internationalised, I suppose, relative to lots of other ones, in that people can use these other units to buy into the carbon markets. But given the relatively small size of the New Zealand carbon market, it also means that those international units are much more important in terms of determining the price than they are in other markets. So this has kind of come to a head in the last couple of years when at the Doha round of the COP18, I believe it is, the New Zealand government decided that they weren't going to sign on to a second commitment for the Kyoto Protocol. And essentially they were shut out of the UN carbon markets after 2013, apart from a transitional period up to 2015, which ended in June 1st of this year. Now, given what I've said already, I'm sure that you can recognise the argument that the New Zealand government makes that it's important or economically efficient and cost effective for New Zealand to be involved in these international markets. However, what we've basically seen in that transition period after it got shut out is that the market has been flooded by a lot of what's referred to there as hot air units, Russian and Ukrainian units that were allocated to those two countries immediately after the Kyoto Protocol and basically bought in New Zealand for just a few cents. And so they've really, according to the Parliamentary Commission of the Environment, which is an independent office, independent of the government, to provide advice and submissions, etc., on a range of environmental issues, it's really discredited the New Zealand ETS. Now, one of the things which I think is most interesting, but also most difficult to find very much information about, and perhaps some people at this table can enlighten us all about the functioning of this, is something which was set up in 2011 called the Asia Pacific Carbon Markets Roundtable. Now, this has been driven by New Zealand. It's an informal gathering. It doesn't have any promise of funding for any of the participants. There's no payoffs. It's self-consciously low-key and not attached to the UNFCCC process. I've spoken to people in the who were involved in the setting up of this in the last little while, and they have urged me to be cautious about how much I talk about this beyond the public record, because there isn't anything officially in the public record about this. So essentially this is a process where they want to have a conversation with other countries who have or are considering domestic market-based carbon instruments, and you can see there the list of different countries which are involved. And essentially what they're trying to do is to think through if we're going to be eventually linking up our carbon markets, what kind of things do we need to put in place? What are the easy things that we can do, which, as that process goes along, will remove some of the obstacles to that. So there's no sense here that they're moving towards a set of binding targets, etc., by which all of these markets will become linked. It's more of an informal conversation around the kinds of issues which have to be resolved in order to facilitate this process later on. So I think this is a really interesting initiative, and yeah, something perhaps that is worth this group thinking about. So at the last meeting, I got the steer that I should be focusing on the the role of institutional investment and pension funds, etc., in terms of mobilising finance, and New Zealand's role in this process. So, what I've been looking at, and a significant proportion of the latter part of the paper is devoted towards, is to look at the kind of investor coalitions which exist in different parts of the world and their role in mobilising finance for this kind of transition. Now, essentially, there's a range of these different kinds of groupings around the world. And you can see there the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, the UK-based one. There's an equivalent one in the US. There is an Asia Investor Group. Perhaps that's something that we need to include in our deliberations here. And essentially, all of these groups are trying to encourage government policies and investment practices that address the risks and opportunities of climate change. So the Australasian version of this is called the Investor Group on Climate Change. Lots and lots of pension funds from both of those countries. A great proportion of them from Australia, which reflects the fact that it's a much larger country and also has had compulsory superannuation for much longer than New Zealand has. But collectively they have about $1 trillion under management. And so this is, as you can imagine, a great opportunity in terms of investing in that region, but other regions in the world, to try and facilitate this transformation. So I've spoken to some people at the IGCC and various other organisations which are attached to it. One which I think is interesting in terms of looking at New Zealand's contribution of it is what's called the New Zealand Super Fund. Now essentially this is set up by the government. It's a sovereign wealth fund, and its role is basically a government contribution towards, in the future, paying pensions to New Zealanders. So it's not controlled by the government, it's independent of that, but it's basically looking for investment opportunities around the world. And as a member of the IGCC and also the Responsible Investments Association of Australasia, it has within its ambit that it's supposed to invest responsibly, and it's not supposed to degrade the reputation of New Zealand internationally. So it's always looking for things where it can maximise its returns, but also do so in a way which is ethical. So talking to some people from New Zealand Super Fund and asking them about the kind of activities which they're doing and the role that they see for Asia, I think came up with some really interesting findings. Essentially, now you can take this as you wish, whether or not this is reflects a reluctance to be involved in the region, or whether what they say is instructive in terms of us learning from it, is that they're interested in investing in these kind of technologies, but they're finding it really, really difficult. So a couple of instances there of investment in renewable technology. In the United States, there's a couple of instances there of investing in wind turbines, using new kinds of technologies, of on-site power generation from fuel cell technology. But the people from the New Zealand Super Fund are basically saying that they're struggling to work out how to be in Asia in the same kind of way. Doubtless there's lots of opportunities here, but they're not really sure how they can go about doing that. So, and essentially this is about the diversity within the region. That it's very difficult to find people, it's possible to find people who are experts in investment opportunities in China, for example, or perhaps in Thailand. It's very difficult to find equivalent people who have an understanding of the regulatory environment across the region. and the kind of capacity to invest in that way. They struggle to find local partners in different places. And there's a perception, whether or not this is true or not, that some countries in the region are suspicious of foreign investors purchasing assets. And so they're interested in investment, but not in terms of purchasing these assets, even on a BOT basis. So, however, there are certainly some instances of members of this coalition who have been successful in this kind of way. And so one of the case studies that I wanted to talk about in the paper is a specialist infrastructure investment company called HLR Morrison & Co. It's a New Zealand company, but which has an office in Hong Kong. How am I going for time, though? Am I getting close to my 25 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, I'll talk quickly. So it's one of those difficult things when you're talking to fund managers where they'll tell you lots of things about their kind of activities, and then they'll say, well, of course all of this is off the record and it's commercial in confidence, and so you can't use any of this. But essentially Morrison & Co. have experience in New Zealand at the time of privatisation in purchasing Trustpower, which is a hydropower development company, and mobilising funds for that process, and they've transferred that expertise particularly to China, where they have a partnership with CGN, where they're involved in a whole range of renewable energy projects, particularly around solar and wind. So I think that Morrison & Co. are a good example where a boutique company with specialist knowledge and local understanding can be involved in this kind of process. However, their observations about the difficulties of transferring their success in China more broadly is that there needs to be, China is an example where the policy framework is very favourable to try and facilitate this kind of transition. According to them, such a framework is less so in other places. Similarly, it's an example where there's local firms with specialist abilities to manage assets and raise funds. There's some kind of investment security, in as much as there's a system of paying tariffs, and at the same time as this infrastructure is being set up, it's being linked to a broader national grid, which means that there's less chance of something being built and then it not being able to realise its potential. So a few lessons there perhaps for other parts of the region.